Hey everyone, welcome to Mr. Noctory, boring ancient history stories for sleep. Tonight, we're headed to Olympia to become an Olympic referee, a job that's both sacred and leaves you wondering, can I say no? You're trained to learn the combat laws, the sacrificial rituals, how to penalize athletes, and even how to spot fake fools. Your role isn't just catching faults. You're the peacekeeper between city-states, under the scorching sun, with no shade. 40,000 people, hundreds of slippery, oiled athletes screaming. No clothes, no microphone, no ice water, just you and a wooden stick. Picture Olympia at noon, burning sand, a distant river, the smell of roasting meat. But before we begin, if this feels like a safe place to hide out tonight, click like and subscribe, but only if you truly want to. Like the rules in an old tavern, you enter only when you need a place to be quiet. And you know what I love most? Reading the comments, seeing where you're from, and what time it is for you. Whether it's New York or Norway, 1 in the morning or 5 in the morning, you're here, and I see you. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on a small fan if you have one. Not because it's hot, but for that soft humming sound. You wake up before dawn, not because of a rooster, not because of a war horn, but because a stomach from ancient Greece is growling. One that will never forgive you for last night's dinner of boiled beans and stale barley bread from 3 days ago. The air is still cold. Winds from the Peloponnesus slip through the straw roof, brush against the torn hem of your thin linen blanket. Outside, your neighbor's wooden sandals clack across gravel as he goes to relieve himself, mixed with sleepy roosters and the damp, goaty smell of wet straw. You sit up quietly, your left shoulder sore from lying on your side too long, studying the competition rules. A new day begins, and beside your bed, like a very responsible insult, lies a rough wooden stick. It's still dark. The wind from the Peloponnesus sneaks through the thatched roof, cold and dusty. You throw on your frayed linen cloak, sit up, and stare at the thing lying quietly beside your bed. A wooden stick. No carvings, no polished handle, no paint at the tip. Just a chunk of olive wood, roughly cut, about 4 feet long enough to raise above a crowd, or tap the shoulder of an athlete mid-argument. You know this stick isn't meant for hitting. It's a symbol of soft power, of law, of the fact that you've just stepped into a role no one really volunteers for. Not a warrior's spear, not a king's scepter, but the stick of an ancient Olympic referee. You, an ordinary person. Now officially, the representative of justice and order. In a place where justice is often covered in olive oil and thrown into the sand. Why were you chosen? Because you're a citizen of the city of Elis, the region with the sacred right to organize and supervise the Olympics. By tradition, referees are selected from adults, educated, with no criminal charges, and most importantly, not prone to punching people during debates. You have no record. You can read. You've never been fined for insulting a god statue. And most importantly, you're not fast enough to be an athlete, not old enough to be a priest, and not dumb enough to say no. No one asked if you wanted this, because this is an honor. The kind of honor the Greeks called kleos, fame passed down through generations. Just too bad no one ever remembered the names of the referees. Outside, Olympia is waking up. In the distance, athletes yelling warm-up chants, fires crackling under barley porridge pots, someone screaming, "Who took my massage oil?" But in the middle of all this chaos, you realize, today, you're part of it. You're not a farmer, you're not a spectator, and you're no longer anonymous. You, the citizen chosen by Ellis to be a referee, have no guards, no statues, no poems in your honor. But if you raise your stick, the match stops. If you issue a penalty, no one dares argue. You take a deep breath and think to yourself, how hard could refereeing be? But what you don't know yet is that within the next 3 hours, you will be cursed at in Homeric verse, hit in the face with a grape skin, and stand between two naked men arguing about who fell more legally. First, erase everything you know about modern sports. No commentators, no fireworks, no slow-motion replays. The ancient Olympics were a sweat-soaked sacrifice. And you, the one holding the stick, you're not just a referee. You are part of a sacred ritual where every fall, every punch, every drop of blood in the sand is seen as a form of honoring the gods. Olympia wasn't a stadium. It was a sanctuary where Zeus reigned among hundreds of statues and temples. At the center stood the altar, where the sacred flame burned throughout the festival. People didn't come here just for fun. They competed as a form of prayer. Before anyone was allowed to participate, every athlete, referee, and spectator had to take part in a sacred oath in front of the altar of Zeus Horkios, the god of oaths. Right hand raised, eyes fixed on the sacred flame. They declared their name, hometown, and vowed to compete fairly without cheating. Those who broke that vow, they were whipped, fined, and if serious, forced to erect a statue. So all of Olympia could curse them forever. At the entrance of the stadium, you've walked past these statues. Silent stone faces, names carved clearly. They're called Zanes, statues of Zeus built from the fines of cheaters. You, the one holding the stick, stand and think quietly. In a place where deceit is immortalized in stone, maybe I should call fouls more carefully. Since 776 before the Common Era, considered the first Olympic Games, every 4 years, Greeks from all over the city-states gathered in Olympia. It didn't matter which side you were on, or what war was going on. Everyone laid down their weapons. All conflicts paused, because the Olympic festival was more sacred than politics. That time was called Ekacheria, the sacred truce. And you, with your tiny wooden stick, stand among thousands of people, knowing. Olympia, from above, looked like a miniature model of the entire Greek world, a place where former enemies now stood on the same bleachers, where everyone raised their eyes to the gods, even if they still glared at each other in silence, where victory was celebrated, but honor was what got carved into stone. There was no other place in ancient Greece where people were both rivals and worshippers, both competitors and worshippers. You weren't just enforcing rules. You were protecting the ritual from drifting away from its true meaning, honoring the gods through mutual respect. If you judged unfairly, you weren't just insulting an athlete, you were offending Zeus himself. That's why the Greeks didn't call referees judges. They called you Hellenodikai, meaning Greeks who execute justice. In their eyes, you didn't represent any city-state. You wore no colors, no flags. You were neutral, entrusted not by votes, but by the belief that you would keep the games from turning into war. You wore white, a symbol of purity. You carried no weapons, only a stick, and your voice, if you misspoke, was blasphemy. A keeper of the law in the heart of ritual. Sounds noble, but this justice, at times, had to be upheld. while standing before 40,000 screaming spectators, your voice hoarse, your robe slippery with oil, and someone just yelled behind you, "Why didn't you call that? He's clearly biting." You think, hold a stick, wear white, call fouls, that's all right. Wrong. To become a Hellenodikai, an official referee of the Olympic Games, you had to undergo 10 months of intense training in the city of Elis. Elis wasn't as famous as Athens, not as powerful as Sparta, but it was the place entrusted by the gods and by the entire Greek world with the sacred responsibility of protecting the Olympics. Since around the 6th century before the Common Era, Elis had established a dedicated referee training system. Every Hellenodikai trained here, not just to learn the rules, but to learn how to conduct yourself like a neutral god. There was a practice field with mock athletes. There was something called the Court of Sports Disputes, where conflicts were judged right in the middle of the festival. And most notably, there were no textbooks, just stone, wooden boards, and teachers chewing dill seeds throughout the lecture. You didn't learn to strike. You didn't learn to dodge. You learned ancient Greek law, the kind of thing that could give even Apollo a headache. Every day, you learned how to distinguish between a foul strike and a sincere accident. A real fall and a staged flop for audience sympathy, a hair grab during wrestling, and a head hold for spiritual energy transmission. You had to memorize rules for each sport: running, wrestling, boxing, javelin, and pancration. A sport with no rules, except no eye gouging, no biting, and if someone dies, they lose. Some events only allowed open hands, no fists. Some allowed punches to the stomach, but not the face. Some, oddly enough, required you to stand still as long as possible. A contest of divine patience. And if you think racing is simple, remember that athletes couldn't start until the rope stretched across the track was dropped by whistle. Anyone who started early was labeled a dishonorable nobody and had to stand facing the statue of a god for the rest of the ceremony, a punishment both strict and extremely humiliating. No eye gouging, no biting, and if someone dies, they lose. The curriculum had no printed books, only old instructors and stone tablets where the names of those who punished wrongly and got sued back were carved in full. Once, you asked your teacher, "What do I do if I'm not sure?" He looked at you, chewing his dill seeds, and said, "Just don't get it wrong." Your first night in the training hall, you couldn't sleep. Not because it was a new place, but because someone had carved into the ceiling, "I once blew the whistle wrong. Now I sell bread in Corinth." You shivered, pulled the blanket over your head, and from the next day on, you started practicing how to stand still in the sun, without squinting. By the 8th month, the simulations began. Observing mock matches, writing down infractions. No clapping, no matter how good the performance was. You learned to keep a straight face, even when someone screamed at you in Homeric verse. Even when someone tried to bribe you with a jar of honey. And then, the 10th month, you stood before the final exam, not a match, but a psychological battle. Your teacher walked over, placed his hand on your shoulder, and said, "True fairness is when you punish someone you actually like." You stayed silent, looked down at your leather sandals, the heels worn down by months of standing still under the sun. You weren't sure if you were tough enough, but you knew, if you didn't uphold the rules, this festival would become a ceremonial joke. You passed the final test. You could now tell the difference between a real chokehold and a dramatic hug. you succeeded. You were handed the stick. You were given the white robe. And you were reminded, from now on, every decision you make will be watched by 40,000 people. That morning, you woke up earlier than usual. Not because you were nervous. Not because you were excited. But because the sunlight of Olympia stabbed into your eyes. Like a gentle reminder from Zeus himself. Today is your first day, referee. You put on your white robe, grabbed your stick, and stepped out of the room where you'd lived for 10 months like a good student. Now, you're the one keeping order among 40,000 people screaming under the sun. Olympia's main gate didn't open with wooden doors. It opened with air. No fortress gate, no fences, just a red dirt path, dusty, leading into the sacred grounds where statues stood, altars burned, and body odor was already forming from every direction. You passed the temple of Hera, past the sacrificial altar. The morning air of Olympia carried a very specific smell. Pine resin from the northern woods, mixed with the smoky fat from camp kitchens. Bronze bells clinked softly in the breeze. Wooden sandals scraped against gravel. Someone whispered a prayer before the ivory statue of Zeus. The entire sanctuary, hundreds of god statues, temples, sacred trees, pressed onto you with a feeling you'd only later learn to name. The weight of ritual. Olympia didn't speak, but you could hear it. A silence that wasn't empty. It was waiting, as if the whole earth was holding its breath for the sound of a wooden stick. And then, you saw the stadium. No plastic seats, no roof. Just a natural valley, carved and sloped with dirt, holding over 40,000 people, sitting, standing, lying down, arguing, eating grapes. The competition field wasn't paved, just a strip of sand, 192 meters long, exactly 600 footsteps of Hercules, according to legend. No fences, no clear boundary lines. The track was marked by 2 stone pillars called balbis, where athletes placed their feet to start. Everything else, sand, dust, shouting, was unregulated. Spectators sat directly on dirt or grass, bringing dried figs, barley cakes, diluted wine, and clay pots for bathroom emergencies. And if there was a dispute, they didn't throw rocks. They recited poetry. Do you even know how Hector lost to Achilles? You dare say that while sitting next to the statue of Athena? You stood among them, dressed in white, alone. And it started to click. Ah, so that's why we trained to stand in the sun for 10 months. The first sound you heard wasn't a greeting. It was someone shouting, "He's using too much oil. He's slipperier than an eel." You turned around. A wrestler, built like a wine jar, was being slathered in oil by his friends, unclear whether for competition or cooking. There was no rule against oil, but there was a rule. No intentionally making it impossible for your opponent to grip. A vague clause, enough to make you sweat, even though it wasn't hot yet. You saw the sand. You saw the sweat. You saw an athlete chewing grapes while shadowboxing. You saw a Spartan noble yelling at an Athenian merchant, fighting for a seat near the temple. You saw Greece, raw, difficult, magnificent. You held your stick with both hands, trying not to shake, trying to remember the clause about oil, trying to keep a neutral face, no frowning, no smiling. You heard sandals scraping the sand, murmured cheering, and flies buzzing around a tray of figs. And you wondered, if 2 people charge at each other right now, would I actually dare to raise this stick? In the distance, a priest was sprinkling wine on the ground, praying for peace that day. You wanted to do the same, But your stick had no wine. And in the middle of it all, there was you, the one in the white robe, nameless, but tasked with keeping the chaos still, in the name of the gods. The sun is high. Over the sky of the Peloponnesus, the midday sunlight doesn't just shine down on your head, it burns away every illusion you ever had about Greek glory. You're standing at the edge of the arena. Your white robe has turned the color of dust. Your forehead, uncertain whether it's sweat or tears. There is no lunch break, no official mealtime for referees. Lunch, if you're lucky, is a handful of dried figs, a crumb of goat cheese, and a sip of warm water from a leather pouch. If you're not lucky, it's a 20-minute boxing match. Two opponents red-faced with rage, one with a broken tooth, and you, being cursed in a 16-syllable poem by a Spartan spectator. No cooling tents. No one asks if you're tired. Behind the stadium, there's a shade made from olive branches and burlap, nicknamed the referee corner. But really, it's just where the clay water jugs sit, and where you can quietly sweat in peace. You once tried sitting there for exactly 5 minutes, hoping to eat a dried fig, and got called over to break up a fight over a beeswax bar used for hand rubbing. A referee has the right to penalize, the right to uphold the law, but not the right to sit longer than a sigh. You, the enforcer of justice, must look alert even when you're hungry, thirsty, and really need to pee. Water is rare. Toilets are more of an abstract idea. Sometimes you just finished a brutal wrestling match and were so thirsty you almost drank the massage oil by mistake. Once, someone flung sand into your face mid-match, and all you could think was, if I cough now, I'll miss that illegal foot sweep. You learned how to hold your thirst, hold your fatigue, even hold your reactions. But no one taught you how to hold your shame when two old men from Athens argued over penalty rules by telling a story about their grandma winning an arm wrestling contest at the Temple of Hera. You once thought referees were just observers, but in reality, you're part supervisor, part physical therapist, part human shield. That afternoon, you penalized a javelin thrower for being too aggressive. He didn't argue, but his coach, an old man with a silver beard who had survived 2 wars, stood up, looked you dead in the eye, and said, "Have you ever thrown anything farther than your own shadow?" The crowd went silent. You stood there frozen like a statue of Hermes. The wind passed. A leaf fell into a bowl of grapes near your feet. You said nothing, just lowered your head, redrew the boundary line, and quietly thought, I kind of miss my old job, sweeping temple courtyards. The afternoon passed without anyone noticing. The sun still blazed. Dust settled into every crease of your sandals, your stick, your robe. And you realized, in Olympia, no one grants you the right to be tired, only the right to keep breathing and hope that Zeus doesn't notice your small mistakes today. No one claps for you. There is no laurel wreath for the one who upholds the rules. Your name won't be carved in stone, won't be remembered in epic poems. But if a match ends in order, no one injured, no riots, no formal complaints filed, that is your only victory. A victory no one sings about. You quietly press your stick into the ground, wipe your forehead, and feel a bit lighter. Not because you're resting, but because no one died today. You're not alone. There are 10 official referees for this Olympic Games. Throughout the 5 months of the Olympics, they take shifts, each group responsible for a different sport, from javelin throw, foot races, to boxing and pancration. But every decision, from penalties to awarding the laurel wreath, must be agreed upon by all 10. There is no boss, no spokesperson, only slow nods and eyes that silently agree. They all come from the city of Elis, and no one knows anyone's name outside of training. There are no teams, no name tags, no medals for outstanding contribution. Just people wearing the same white robe as you, holding the same stick, and sharing the same skill. Standing still in chaos without getting hit. Some are old, thin, silver-bearded, once warriors in the Messenian Wars. Some are young, small-framed, chosen for having neat handwriting good enough for penalty records. And there's one you've noticed for a while, always smiling when scolded, always arriving a half step before you, and eyes that look like they once wrote poetry for Athena and were rejected. Referees don't sleep in tents. They live in a special building called the Leonidaion, usually reserved for honored guests, but every Olympic season it becomes a makeshift dorm for those who guard the rituals. There are no grand feasts. Meals are simple: dry barley bread, black olives, a few figs, and diluted honey water, the kind that saves your voice if you have to shout over 40,000 people arguing about false starts. No one chats during matches. No one pats your back, whether you judged right or wrong. Only glances across the crowd, brief, subtle, wordless, but enough for you to know. I get it too. You begin to understand a language with no sound. Not everyone needs praise. Some people just need to be seen. And amid the tens of thousands of screams, footsteps, and sticks tapping sand, a silent glance, a nod from across the field, is enough to pull you back into the moment. I'm not invisible. I'm not alone. Once, after a tense match, you had a 10-minute break in the shade behind the Temple of Hera. The old silver-bearded man approached, handed you half a fig, and said, "I once made a wrong call in the Olympics of 432 before the Common Era. But that day, no one died, so no one wrote it down." You laughed for the first time that day, not because of the story, but because of the truth. Being a referee means doing it right, in silence. That evening, you sat by the Alpheus River, watching the moon reflect on the water. In the distance, singing echoed from the tent of the victorious athlete. His name would be carved in stone, written into poems, cast into statues. And you breathe, you rest your stick, and thank the heavens, because tomorrow there will once again be 10 people in white standing in the storm. There are moments in life when no matter how many rules you've memorized, how many figs you've eaten, how many breaths you've taken before blowing the whistle, trouble still finds your face. And sometimes it comes in the form of a grape skin flying through the air. That afternoon's wrestling match was going normally. 2 wrestlers, as big as storage jars, rolling around in the sand, sweat, olive oil, and growling. No punching, no eye gouging. Just a chokehold that was a bit too enthusiastic. You blew the whistle, tapped the stick to the ground, gave a warning, not a disqualification. The Athens crowd nodded. The Sparta crowd roared like they'd just lost their cattle. And then a shout rose from the lower rows. "That's my son. He didn't foul. He was hugging." You looked down. A woman with silver hair neatly tied back, in a purple robe, the wrestler's mother. Spartan mothers didn't just give birth to warriors. They also raised mythical-level debaters. They knew every clause of the competition rules, not because they read books, but because they once beat up referees in their youth. And if their sons were wrestlers, they were the ones who coached by hand and argued with nerves of bronze. One word from them could make a general step back. One look from them could silence an entire crowd. You are not the first referee they've threatened, and you definitely won't be the last. She didn't come alone. She came with 6 others, all wearing the face of someone who once taught their child to wrestle barehanded. They stepped past people, past statues, and stopped at the edge of the arena, pointing straight at you. You lowered your stick, held your gaze, and reminded yourself, don't react to emotion. Don't react to grapes. I am the law. But emotions and grapes don't follow the law. A grape skin floated gently over the front row. Another landed on your robe, leaving a purple-red stain. You didn't flinch. You had been trained not to back down from yelling. Trained how to handle interference from athlete families. You lifted your head, looked her in the eye, and recited the rules word for word. Olympic wrestling laws weren't long, but they were vague. There's a line that says, no choking beyond what is necessary. But no one defines what necessary means. Often, you, the referee, are not just the enforcer, but also a linguist, an ethicist, and a facial expression interpreter. You must distinguish between a deliberate choke and a hug that was just a little too sincere. And if you judge wrong, good luck with the next round of airborne grapes. Neck hold longer than 2 breaths counts as choking. Choking, if not released, is a foul. Foul, if repeated, may lead to disqualification. She said nothing more, just grunted, and pulled her squad away, muttering as she left. Back in the day, judgments were fairer. The match resumed. You returned to position, brushed the grape skin off your sleeve. No one clapped for you. No one called your name. No one wrote poems about you. But no one threw anything else. And in that fragile silence, you suddenly understood. In Olympia, silence is the most precious reward a referee can receive. There are no bronze statues, no praises sung, just an afternoon that passed with no deaths, no uprisings, no demands for a rematch. And you think, maybe, today was a good day. You've made it through 5 days. Each day, a grape storm, a sandstorm, a protest in verse. You thought you were used to it. And then, Pancration came. Not everyone knows the word, but when the drums start, people go silent. Because this is no longer sport. This is sanctioned chaos. The Greeks believed that Theseus, the one who killed the Minotaur in the labyrinth, was the first to invent pancration. Not to compete, but to survive. Pancration isn't for the fast, not for the pretty, but for the one who takes the most hits and doesn't fall first. Pancration, in Greek, means all power. Every kick, every punch, every choke is allowed. The only rules, no eye gouging, no biting. And if someone dies, it's considered a draw. Historian Pausanias once told the story of a pancration match in the 5th century before the Common Era. Athlete Archition from Phegalia was choked to death by his opponent. But before passing out, he managed to land a kick to the hip, forcing a surrender. The result? The dead man got the laurel wreath. The living one walked away in shame. Ancient Olympics didn't glorify mercy, only glorified the one who fell last. You stood beside the ring. The air was tight as a bowstring. 2 fighters stepped out, one built like a bull, the other thin as a reed. Neither of them smiling. You exhaled softly. The stick in your hand trembled. The match began. No greeting, only the sound of wind as the spinning kicks slice past your ear. Sand sprayed into your eyes. The crowd roared, unclear if cheering or praying to the gods. 5 minutes passed. A punch to the neck, a sweep to the leg, a shoulder lock. You looked closely, saw a clear bite mark on the thin fighter's left arm. You stepped in, raised your stick, pointed, warning. They both looked at you, said nothing. Then nodded together. You stepped back. Sweat slid down your spine. You thought, I just warned 2 men who could snap me like twigs, and I'm still alive. I'm actually good at this. By the 10th minute, the big man collapsed. No reaction. The thin fighter held his head, gasping. The crowd went silent. You stepped in, touched the big man's chest, still breathing. You raised your hand, signaled the end. No cheers, no protests, only 3 drum beats, marking the end of the battle. You don't remember how you breathed during those 15 minutes. Don't remember whether you raised your left or right hand. You only remember you didn't close your eyes, because if you closed them, someone would die. And failure in pancration isn't about misjudging a punch, but failing to see the thin line between victory and stubbornness. You sat down behind the temple of Hera, wiped your face, didn't know if it was water, blood, or just fermented grape from the day before. You had just survived pancration. No one died. No one had to be carried out. And you started to believe Zeus might have been standing behind you the whole match. You think the Olympics are sacred, beautiful contests with fragrant laurel wreaths. Sure. But beneath that pure white robe, there are truths, stickier than the smell of olive oil sweat. Athletes were completely naked. Yes, not a thread on them. Not because they were beautiful, but to honor the body and let the gods see clearly. Now imagine standing under the scorching sun, watching athletes glistening in olive oil slip and slide. You'll understand why referees were always nervous. And to maximize slipperiness, athletes rubbed themselves with olive oil before competing. Not for moisturizing, but because they believed it kept their muscles warm and made their bodies more flexible in the heat. But for the referee, this only turned every wrestling move into a mini ice skating accident. You've never seen a hold so desperate as when one person as slippery as an eel grabs another just as slippery. No restrooms for 40,000 people. Yep. Olympia was just a dirt valley with no sanitation system. Spectators brought their own clay pots to take care of business. The smell. Imagine a week-long feast with 40,000 people and not a single toilet. And it wasn't just the smell of humans. There was also the scent of goats, sheep, and grilled meat. Each team brought along an animal to sacrifice to Zeus, then grilled it immediately afterward. The result, Olympia resembled a giant BBQ festival. No electric stoves, no trash bags. And the smell was so intense, you could smell the gods from 300 paces away. Pancration, the no-limits combat sport. Only 2 rules. No eye gouging, no biting. You could punch, kick, choke, even wrestle someone unconscious. It wasn't sport. It was combat witnessed by the gods. No gold, silver, or bronze medals. Winners only received a laurel wreath made of sacred olive leaves. And maybe a poem or statue if they were lucky. No cash prizes, no cars, just glory and sweat. A sacred truce was declared. All wars, no matter how intense, had to pause during the Olympics. But only weapons paused, not tensions. Anyone who violated the truce was seen as insulting Zeus and faced severe punishment. Referees underwent extreme training. It wasn't a simple job. You had to study the rules, learn how to judge, and learn to endure insults delivered in poetic form. Not everyone had the honor of becoming a referee. Only citizens of Elis had that right. Their duty, to maintain the fragile balance between glory and chaos. Chariot drivers weren't considered winners. In chariot races, it was the horse owner who got the wreath. The driver, the one risking his life, got no glory. Many athletes died from extreme competition. Some pancration matches ended in actual death, and many others walked away with lifelong injuries. Women faced extreme exclusion. Women were banned from competing and even attending, except for priestesses of Demeter. Any violator could be stoned or expelled from Olympia. And anyone who cheated in competition, regardless of gender, faced harsh punishment. Their fines were used to erect statues of Zeus, called the Zanes, right at the stadium entrance. Each statue had the cheater's name carved into it, so they would be remembered forever by both gods and mortals. Today, over 16 Zanes still stand, not to honor, but to warn. Women were banned from competing and attending, except priestesses of Demeter. Violators could be stoned or expelled from Olympia. You can probably imagine the ancient Olympics now, a world not just of light and flowers, but also sweat, blood, campfire smoke, and grape skins flying across your face. At last, the day is over. No more shouting, no more footsteps pounding the ground. No more olive oil glistening under the burning sun. Only you, the stick, and a thin line of dust rising from an empty stadium. You walk slowly toward the temple of Zeus, where goats were once brought for sacrifice, where your hand once trembled announcing a winner, where you bowed every morning, not to pray, but to remind yourself that you were only the keeper of rules, not part of the glory. There is a small stone statue covered in moss. No one looked at it during the past 5 days. No one mentioned it in poems. But you, the referee, stop in front of it. Not because it's sacred, but because it's silent. Maybe it's a Zane statue, raised from the fines of cheaters. Or maybe it's a Herm column, a symbol for forgotten travelers. You don't need to know its name, because you see yourself in that silence, a witness, not seeking victory, not seeking praise. Just the right to exist on the edge of history. You place your hand on the statue. You wish for nothing. You just breathe, softly. After all the invisible wounds you've carried through the Olympic days. In the distance, people begin packing. Athletes are folding their tents. Those who lost, quietly. Those who won, also, quietly. No one laughs out loud. No one dances. Only the sound of brooms sweeping sand. Horse hooves mixed with the soft wind of late afternoon. The Olympics end not with applause. No music. No torch parade. No victory speech. Only a simple rite. The sacred flame is extinguished by the hand of the temple keeper. The referees, the Hellenodikai, step back from the field without looking over their shoulders, not out of pride, but because they believe. Olympia should not witness the tears of those who kept it whole, only the soft sigh of those who survived it. You carry no souvenir, only a small cloth bag, inside a scroll of rules, a wooden whistle, and a few bruises not yet healed. Tomorrow, back in Elis, you'll sit among others who once held the same post. You won't tell stories of triumph, only glances and quiet pauses between sips of wine, as if everyone understands but no one puts it into words. You turn away, say nothing, greet no one, just walk toward the sunset, like a breeze carrying the scent of olive oil and dried grapes. Tomorrow you will leave Olympia. No one will remember your name. No statue will be carved for you. No song will be written. But you know, you stood there, among the dust, among the chaos, and held it all together. The final evening. The empty arena by day now sparkles with lamplight. The wind is cooler. People speak less. Everyone sits down, winners or losers alike. There are no grand feasts. Just barley bread, a bit of salted fish, and watered down grape wine. Not enough to intoxicate, just enough to warm. The victors might be invited to share some meat from the sacrifice, usually grilled goat or lamb. But the rest, athletes, commoners, slaves, only have pressed bread, dried fig skins, and weak wine mixed with weeds. No one is full, but no one complains, because eating in silence is also a way to preserve the last sacred breath of the festival. You, the referee, sit at the edge of the table. No one invited you, but no one turned you away. No one clinks cups, but everyone pours a little for the person beside them. No one asks who won. No one recalls the finest strike. Only vague nods beneath the lantern smoke, and glances, sometimes, that meet briefly, as if everyone just weathered the same storm, and doesn't need to retell it, only to know. They weren't alone. You see him, the wrestler who lost, the one who made crowds roar on the first day, but now only bows his head, hands still covered in dry sand and bruises yet to turn color. He says nothing. He doesn't eat much either. Just occasionally looks around, as if waiting for someone. Then his eyes meet yours. No anger, no blame, just quiet. In that fleeting moment, you understand. That look isn't asking, why did I lose? It's asking, will I be remembered? Was I worthy of the years I gave? Will anyone write my name in the dirt, even with a finger, when I leave without applause? You don't answer. You simply pour wine into his clay cup. He nods, drinks, then reaches down and removes the leather strap from his wrist, placing it on the table in front of you. Not as a gift, but as a reminder that he had once been here. The leather strap is all that remains of the match. Not for decoration, but to remind himself he once stepped onto the sands of Olympia, once fought, once lost, and once was witnessed. They say, when a wrestler takes off his strap, it's a farewell with no words, no victory, no golden plaque, but a glance and someone who will remember. You stay silent, like the entire feast, because in Olympia, sorrow, if it comes, always walks barefoot. No noise, no spilled wine, just quietly leaving before the dawn. No one knows your name. No inscription records the words you once said. No statue, no medal. You are not an athlete. You didn't compete. You didn't win. You didn't lose. You just stood between two others and tried to keep the world from falling apart. Each morning, you rose earlier than everyone else. Not to warm up, but to remember the rules. Not to train, but to sit still. To listen to the wind, to guess the sun's path, to calculate the angle between your pointing stick and the gaze of a competitor. You once trained for 10 months just to learn how to stay silent at the right moment. You once set aside emotion when watching someone fall. You once took a slap from an athlete for being unfair, but still had to stand tall. You once blew your whistle to stop a match before anyone could stop the bleeding. You once penalized a victor for a final blow that crossed the line. You once stepped between two burning bodies with nothing but a wooden stick and a pair of eyes that did not blink. No one sings about you. There is no ballad name for the Olympic referee, no tragedy and no epic, only the sediment of fairness, settled beneath the sand, lying at the edge of glory and only appearing. When one truly listens to history with their heart, you are no longer young, but not yet old. Just old enough to understand. To be the one who stands in between is an honor that needs no acknowledgement, because some things are never remembered, but never disappear. The life of Baldwin IV, the leprous king. No one knows where the first cry echoed. All we know is that from that moment, a kingdom began its countdown. Baldwin IV, a name that would later be tied to one of the most fragile dynasties in the history of the Crusades, was born in early summer of 1161. At that time, the Levant was an unstable chessboard. To the north, Nur ad-Din, the Zengid lord of Aleppo, was consolidating power after multiple military victories, including the capture of Edessa in 1144 and the repulsion of the Second Crusade. Crusader states like Jerusalem, Tripoli, and Antioch were not only drained of manpower, but also fractured internally among French, Norman, and Italian lineages. Jerusalem, though the administrative and religious center of the region, had royal power constantly entangled with church authority, local nobles, and pressure from the West. It was a world where every child born into the royal family carried a burden, and Baldwin, though he could not yet speak, was already a piece on the board of conflict between East and West. No exact birth date was recorded, no inscription, no decree, only oral tradition, perhaps in the city of Jerusalem. His father was Amalric, Count of Jaffa and Ascalon, a Frankish noble of royal blood, tasked with defending the southern outpost of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. His mother was Agnes of Courtenay, from a noble family of Edessa that had once fallen to Muslim forces, but still carried the echoes of a glorious past. The boy was named after the reigning king at the time, Baldwin III, who had just spent a decade fighting to stabilize the kingdom after his father's death, a mother acting as regent, and internal power struggles among siblings. Baldwin III was also the child's godfather during the baptism, a quiet ceremony, yet one that planted in the Holy Land a name destined for fate, Baldwin IV. However, history has no mercy for children born carrying the hopes of a dynasty. Just 2 years later, in February 1163, Baldwin III died at the age of 33. He left no heirs, no descendants, and departed the throne like a traveller collapsing midway through a journey. Contemporary accounts suggest dysentery as the cause, but within Jerusalem's stone corridors, whispers claimed he was poisoned. With Baldwin III's death, the only legitimate successor was Amalric, Baldwin IV's father. But to claim the crown, Amalric had to annul his own marriage, because the church claimed he and Agnes were too closely related. The reason sounded theological, but was in truth political. The clergy didn't want Agnes as queen, and Amalric, ever the pragmatist, complied. He declared the marriage void in order to ascend the throne. Little Baldwin, not yet 2 years old, became the unofficial heir, born of a union erased from canon law and raised in a royal court constantly on guard. His only sister, Sibylla, born in 1158 or 1159, would later become inextricably linked to his life's tragedy. But at this point, they were just two children in a court that had never known peace. Jerusalem, from 1161 to 1163, when Baldwin IV was still swaddled, was a quiet city under tension. It was the seat of power for the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but constantly threatened from the north. Nur ad-Din, the Muslim emir expanding his power from Syria, had already threatened several Crusader territories. Within the city, Latin clergy not only managed the churches, but also played a decisive role in royal affairs, including intervening in royal marriages, as they did by forcing Amalric to divorce Agnes. In this political chess game, there was no space for childhood. A child like Baldwin wasn't born to play, but to be placed onto the historical board. The city was sacred, a battlefield, a political center, and a fragile stone propped between the Islamic world. Its walls had once run red during the First Crusade, and among the rusting spears, a silent child was carried across the threshold of destiny. No one knew that beneath his pale skin, a disease was already asleep, something that would turn Baldwin, the younger son, into the ruler no one expected, the untouchable king, the last to hold Jerusalem before everything fell apart. To become king, Baldwin's father had to give up Baldwin's mother. In 1163, the crown of Jerusalem did not belong to a son, but to a negotiation between the throne and the church. When Baldwin III, a young and courageous king with no heirs, suddenly died at the age of 33, the throne fell to the only one left with royal blood, his brother, Amalric. But for Amalric to ascend the throne, it wasn't just lineage that mattered. He had to overcome a major obstacle, the judgment of the High Council of Jerusalem, a powerful religious institution that acted as the coordinator of both sacred and secular power in the Crusader kingdom. Since the early 1160s, as the threat from Nur ad-Din, the rising Muslim leader from Aleppo and Damascus, grew more severe, the clergy had begun to intervene more aggressively in royal affairs. They saw the choice of queen not as a matter of marriage, but as a survival strategy for a kingdom besieged militarily and diplomatically. To become king, Baldwin's father had to give up Baldwin's mother. In 1163, the crown of Jerusalem did not belong to a son, but to a negotiation between the throne and the church. When Baldwin III, a young and courageous king with no heirs, suddenly died at the age of 33, the throne fell to the only one left with royal blood, his brother, Amalric. Amalric was a seasoned warrior ruling over the lands of Jaffa and Ascalon. But to step through the royal gates, he had to face a condition no father wants to hear. His marriage to Agnes of Courtenay was not accepted. The clergy, wielding significant power in Jerusalem, ruled that Agnes and Amalric were too closely related, fourth cousins, a relationship not uncommon in medieval noble marriages. But behind the veil of canon law was political calculation. Agnes was deemed unfit to be queen. Not noble enough, not influential enough, not supported enough at court. The strongest voices came from the Latin clergy, who were both spiritual leaders and political gatekeepers of the Crusader kingdom. They did not want a queen they couldn't control. Amalric did not resist. He needed the crown, and to him, Jerusalem needed a king more than it needed a romance. The marriage was annulled. Agnes was forced to leave the royal palace. She would never be queen, but she kept her two children, a daughter named Sibylla and a toddling son, Baldwin. This event also reflected the fragile balance of power between Jerusalem's court and the Western churches. Since the early 1160s, the Latin Church in Jerusalem had been under pressure from Rome, where Pope Alexander III was consolidating his power amidst internal Catholic disputes. From the West, envoys regularly sent rebukes to Jerusalem about the decline of morality and theological authority in the Crusader territories. Thus, the decision to invalidate Amalric and Agnes's marriage wasn't merely internal politics, but also a diplomatic message to the Roman papacy. Jerusalem still adhered to canon law, even at the cost of royal blood. From 1163 onward, Agnes's position at court remained divisive. Though she no longer held the title of queen, she retained custody of her son and influence among the local noble networks in the Levant. Some clergy saw her presence as a threat to the unity of royal power. Others saw in Agnes a mediator between French, Armenian, and local knightly factions. During Baldwin's early years living with his mother, Jerusalem was not only the Crusader capital, but a chessboard where every personal alliance could shift the fate of the kingdom. As for Amalric, though he remarried Maria Komnene, niece of the Byzantine emperor, he never had another son. That made Baldwin, though born of an annulled marriage, the sole heir of royal blood. This was the essential paradox of Jerusalem's 12th century politics. A child cast out by ecclesiastical decree, yet pulled by historical destiny into the heart of royal power. No one could be certain. Was the decision of 1163 an act to preserve kingship, or the beginning of a prolonged crisis of succession? A child who does not feel pain may not feel life. In the year 1170, as Jerusalem faced tensions on both fronts, with the Fatimid incursions from Egypt in the south and relentless pressure from Nur ad-Din in Syria to the north, William of Tyre returned to Jerusalem from a diplomatic mission in Constantinople. In his hands were letters from the Byzantine emperor addressed to King Amalric of Jerusalem, and in his heart a greater aspiration to educate the next generation. As a learned cleric, William had studied in Paris and Bologna, the greatest centers of Western knowledge at the time, and now he was appointed tutor to the 10-year-old heir, Baldwin, the son of Amalric and Agnes. In a world where most princes were raised by mercenaries or ascetic monks, William, a true intellectual, becoming the official tutor was an unusual step. He not only taught Baldwin Latin and the scriptures, but also introduced the prince to the concepts of justice, diplomacy, and resilience. Baldwin was a bright child, calm, observant. But William was the first to notice something was wrong. One afternoon in the palace courtyard, William noticed the noble children playing a game of pinching each other's arms. The children screamed when hurt, but Baldwin did not. Though pinched, punched, even lightly bitten, he laughed and showed no reaction. At first, William thought it was the stoicism of a royal child, but upon closer examination, he was horrified to discover the right half of Baldwin's arm had completely lost sensation. William did not sound the alarm. He asked questions, observed, took notes. In the later part of his chronicle, he recalled, "The boy did not react even when pinched hard by a friend. I thought it was his endurance. But then I found the right half of his arm had no sensation." And then, with growing concern, he spoke to King Amalric. A limb that feels nothing is the sign of a soul under threat. Latin doctors, Arab physicians, even mystics were summoned. Ointments, talismans, acupuncture, none worked. What afflicted Baldwin was not merely numbness, it was the beginning of leprosy. Hansen's disease, as it would later be called, was not yet understood at the time, but it was feared enough to turn any patient into a social outcast. Amalric kept it secret. Politically, it made perfect sense. The court had once been shaken by the debate over the legitimacy of Baldwin's mother, Agnes. A physical blemish on the prince, if made public, could serve as grounds for noble factions to deny his right to succession, especially at a time when several factions within the royal council were lobbying to re-establish alliances with Western princes. A leprous prince was a succession disaster. But William knew, if unprepared, the kingdom would be caught off guard. From that point, a strange relationship formed between the two, a historian and a prince, where the teacher educated, but also quietly feared the student might die young. William continued his role, hiding his anxiety behind lessons in Roman history, Greek philosophy, and the conquests of Charlemagne. But beyond scholastic education, he also taught Baldwin highly practical skills for a future king. How to manage courtiers, how to read the minds of generals, and especially how to hold authority while bearing a weakness. In his gaze, there was always something unspoken. Would this child live long enough to wear the crown? The crown does not wait for the one who wears it to be strong enough. In the summer of 1174, the kingdom of Jerusalem blazed under the sun and echoed with prayers. King Amalric, who had once led campaigns deep into Egypt, was dying. After a failed campaign at the city of Banias, Amalric returned to Jerusalem physically exhausted. He had contracted dysentery, a common but often fatal illness in the pre-antibiotic era. Despite care from Latin, Greek, and even Muslim physicians, his condition worsened. On July 11, 1174, Amalric died in a high fever at the age of 38. His successor was Baldwin, only 13 years old. A pale teenager, his right arm paralyzed, his face already ravaged by leprosy, was about to become king of Jerusalem. There was no grand coronation, no cavalry parading through city gates. Jerusalem was in a state of crisis. Nur ad-Din, the most powerful Muslim lord in the region, had just died in May 1174, leaving a power vacuum in Syria. However, that vacuum did not last. A military commander full of ambition, Salah ad-Din, Saladin, a former courtier of Nur ad-Din, was quickly gaining control of both Cairo and Damascus, step by step forming a unified Islamic empire to the south and north of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. With the collapse of the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt and the fragmentation of the Crusader states, Jerusalem found itself besieged on two fronts. The death of Amalric meant the kingdom lost a king who had personally led the Egyptian campaigns, and in his place stood a boy already afflicted. In that context, putting a child on the throne was not just a ritual, it was a political gamble. Many clergy and nobles feared that having a leprous king could be seen by Muslim rivals as a sign of divine abandonment, damaging military morale. Some even proposed establishing a long-term regency or inviting a European prince to rule instead. Before the formal coronation, rumors circulated among Jerusalem's nobility. Should the enthronement be postponed? In a world where appearance and omens held weight, holding a royal ceremony just after the previous king's death, while the country lacked direction and the successor was ill, made many hesitate. But then, the court decided not to delay. The throne could not remain empty. The biggest issue: who would rule in his place? At 13, Baldwin was not yet considered of age. According to kingdom tradition, 15 was the age of manhood to rule independently. Therefore, a regent was needed, someone with enough credibility to defend the throne against noble factions. Miles of Plancy, the Chancellor of Jerusalem, was the first to seize the regency. But only weeks later, Raymond of Tripoli, one of the oldest and most powerful nobles of Outremer, arrived in the capital and declared that the regency belonged to him. Raymond was a descendant of Raymond of Toulouse, a former leader of the First Crusade, and had spent years as a prisoner of Nur ad-Din. Tensions began to rise between court factions. Baldwin's mother, Agnes of Courtenay, quietly backed Miles. Meanwhile, Raymond had support from northern lords and knightly orders like the Templars. As the nobles fought for power, the knightly orders, especially the Templars and the Hospitallers, responded with caution. Though they were military and religious pillars of the kingdom, they made no official statements. But chronicles show both orders were concerned about the stability of a dynasty led by a leprous teenager. Some Templar commanders privately voiced worries that a weak king would demoralize the troops. Meanwhile, the Hospitallers, with their tradition of caring for the sick, were gentler and continued to provide logistical support to the court. Yet both orders knew they were standing before a fragile dynasty surrounded by Islamic forces. Baldwin lay in bed, burning with fever as leprosy began to spread across his face. His fingers curled, his eyes often swollen red from corneal ulcers. And yet, at the end of 1176, Baldwin suddenly reappeared before the public at the Feast of St. George, on horseback, wearing a red cloak, holding a cross. It was the signal he had come of age. From then on, he would no longer be the heir child. He was truly king, in a world that believed leprosy was a sign of divine punishment. The throne has no armrests, only sharp edges. In 1176, Baldwin IV had just turned 15. At that age, in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, one was considered of age, ready to rule without a regent. But when it came to Baldwin, no one truly believed he was a complete king. Leprosy had deeply embedded itself in his body. His right hand had nearly lost all sensation. His left eye, once struck by corneal ulcers, was now fully blurred, and his skin, once as smooth as a prince from legend, was now rough and scaly. Courtiers, from knightly orders to clergy, wrestled between loyalty and pity. But Baldwin asked for no pity. On horseback, red cloak flying in the April wind, he declared power like a blade that did not rust. Sometimes the skin of his hands cracked open, blood seeping under the iron gloves. Yet he still held the reins, still summoned counsel, still inspected fortresses near the borders. To him, physical wounds were less frightening than the pitying gaze of a general or the hesitation of a knight. He did not marry, could not, but he chose to hold the crown like someone holding a lantern in the midst of a desert storm. Those seated near the throne, the knightly orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, reacted differently to Baldwin's reign. While the Knights Templar, the elite military force, maintained a cautious and watchful stance, the Hospitallers, originally founded to care for the sick, showed more overt loyalty. Some sources record that Hospitaller commanders saw serving a leper king as a religious duty, as if God were testing them through this very leader. In 1176, right after Baldwin assumed direct power, certain records state that the Grand Masters of both knightly orders privately met the king to pledge allegiance. Both orders knew full well that if Jerusalem fell, all symbols of the Crusades would be swept into dust. Supporting a sick king was not just loyalty, it was defending the very sacred foundations they had vowed to uphold. No king rules alone, especially not a king with leprosy. Baldwin began to gather around him a group of courtiers, men who were both loyal and shrewd. One of the most notable figures was William of Tyre, the former tutor, now royal advisor and official court historian. William, with his sharp writing and clear-eyed realism, became the one who chronicled Baldwin's life with both respect and concern. Another figure, Reynold of Châtillon, once imprisoned for 15 years by Muslim forces, now returned like a belligerent spectre. Reynold became Baldwin's military arm, a man even Saladin had to reckon with. And yet, within the court lay a labyrinth of daggers. Some historians believe there were at least 2 assassination or deposition plots against Baldwin between 1177 and 1180, driven by fears that his reign would not last. Whispers in closed council chambers often circled a single question. If this king doesn't live through the coming winter, who will sit on the throne? Baldwin's mother, Agnes of Courtenay, remained a shadow power. His sister, Sibylla, was a pawn in the marriage politics of warring factions. In reality, from 1176 onward, the Jerusalem court became a chessboard of power with 3 major factions. The first was the northern Levant nobility, led by Raymond of Tripoli, who wanted to reduce the Courtenay family's influence and restore traditional aristocratic order. The second was the faction of Agnes of Courtenay, Baldwin's mother, backed by newly arrived Western nobles, including Guy of Lusignan. The third were the Ibelin family, politically moderate but strategically dominant through marital alliances. The rivalry between these 3 turned the court into both a palace and a secret battlefield, a throne with 3 spears. Jerusalem, at that time, faced not only Saladin, who was uniting Syria and Egypt. The greater issue was, who would succeed Baldwin if, or rather when, he died? Baldwin had no children, no younger brother. The only legitimate heir was Sibylla, his sister. But Sibylla was a political enigma, too beautiful, too young, too easily manipulated. Baldwin's mother's faction wanted her to marry a Western noble close to them. Raymond of Tripoli's faction sought to delay, hoping to draw in a powerful European prince. Between these forces, Baldwin had to maintain balance, like a man crossing a rope bridge between 2 cliffs. In 1177, an event occurred that made all eyes turn to Baldwin not with pity, but with awe. The leper king, with a hand that could no longer feel, would lead an army into battle. No one believed a leprous teenager could slow down an empire. At the end of 1177, Saladin, the young commander from Tikrit, launched a major invasion into Crusader territory. After years of consolidating power in Cairo and annexing Damascus, Saladin had become the undisputed leader of the Sunni Muslim world in the Levant. Jerusalem, ruled by a young king with leprosy, was seen as the easiest target. With an army of nearly 26,000 men, Saladin crossed the Sinai Desert and marched straight toward Ascalon, the southern gateway of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Baldwin, then only 16 and burning with fever from a resurgence of illness, was advised to retreat to the capital. But he refused. Instead of fleeing, Baldwin summoned a cavalry force supported by the Knights Templar. He ordered a surprise attack on the Muslim army, which had scattered to loot and resupply. On November 25, 1177, the Battle of Montgizard took place and ended in a shock for both Europe and the Muslim world. Under Baldwin's direct command, the Crusader army ambushed at a strategic location near the Yarkon River, where Saladin and his Egyptian forces were moving along the road from Ascalon to Ramla. Using the element of surprise and familiar terrain, the Frankish cavalry, led by the Templars, split the Muslim formation into smaller, isolated groups. Baldwin, though carried on a litter behind the main line, still gave direct orders for flanking maneuvers and demanded the relic of the True Cross be brought to the battlefield as the supreme spiritual symbol. Saladin was completely defeated. Most of his army was either destroyed or forced to retreat across the desert in chaos. Many soldiers died of thirst or were ambushed in the southern gorges near Ramla. The battle sent shockwaves. Popes in Rome issued letters of praise, and cities in Italy and France held public prayers. Baldwin, carried on a litter, unable to ride a horse for the entire battle, was hailed by his army as a living saint. William of Tyre recorded, "They believed only the intervention of St. George saved Jerusalem that day, but most of the victory came from Baldwin's resolve when all his commanders wished to withdraw." Reverence and fear. The Battle of Montgizard transformed Baldwin from a pitied king into a symbol. Throughout the Crusader territories, from Antioch to Tripoli, his name was spoken in churches with awe and admiration. To many, he was no longer just a political figure, but a living witness that God could act even through bodies deemed forsaken. The knightly orders, once hesitant, now looked upon him with respect. Latin clergy saw him as proof of the trial and glory God lays upon strong souls. Especially the Templars and Hospitallers, the kingdom's two most important military religious orders, began to publicly pledge allegiance to Baldwin, not only for his crown, but for the faith they believed was being tested through his wounded body and resilient spirit. The presence of a leper king was no longer a source of shame. It became the symbol of Jerusalem, a kingdom diseased, yet surviving. But on the other side, Saladin did not forget that humiliation. The unifier of Egypt and Syria now swore he would not stop until his flag flew above the Holy Sepulchre. Baldwin knew this. He had no illusions. After the victory, he ordered the reconstruction of defensive lines from Ascalon to Jerusalem and expanded the network of watchtowers in Gaza and along the Judean frontier. He also accelerated the fortification of castles at Kerak and Montreal, vital checkpoints on desert pilgrimage and trade routes. With cooperation from the knightly orders, especially the Hospitallers in logistics, he created a defensive belt stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the edge of the Red Sea. Leprosy advanced, but so did Saladin. On the map, they were two opposing dots, but across every inch of the Levant, they were two wills refusing to die. There are victories that don't change fate, only delay the moment of facing it. November 25th, 1177. Amid the dusty plains of Montgizard and low olive groves, a battle unfolded unlike any in the military textbooks. Saladin's army, over 20,000 strong, was marching north to capture Ramla, believing Jerusalem lay undefended, and its king was dying. But Baldwin IV didn't die. Not then. With a high fever, unable to hold a sword with his right hand, nearly blind in his left eye, Baldwin was strapped to a wooden litter placed behind the Frankish cavalry. Some accounts say he couldn't even stand on his own. His body drained from fever, his hands cracked from desert wind, he still nodded when his generals asked if he was ready for battle. There was no grand ceremony, only the sound of horsehide, the smell of sweat, and a young king bound to life and death by will alone. As the Knights Templar galloped through Saladin's flank, Baldwin lay there, amid trumpet blasts, battle prayers, and dust rising like summer thunder. In his hands was the true cross, brought out from the church's treasury by a priest, held high like a final relic. And then the impossible happened. According to chroniclers, Saladin had not expected the vastly outnumbered crusaders to attempt an ambush in terrain unsuitable for retreat. The area near Montgizard, between low olive trees and the banks of the Yaqon River, threw the Egyptian formation into disarray. The Templar cavalry struck the center, while Saladin's forces were stretched thin, many of them still scattered foraging near Ramla. Saladin was defeated, not because of power, not because of numbers, but because they didn't believe a dying man would dare ride into the heart of battle. When death no longer threatens, William of Tyre wrote that the knights saw upon the king's face a sacred light, either from God or from one who had overcome the fear of death. Some say that Baldwin, the night before the battle, whispered prayers not for himself, but for the city. Others wrote that his lips were cracked, his hands trembled with fever, yet he still ordered the relic to the front, saying, "If Jerusalem must fall, let it fall while the cross still stands." That sentence, half theology, half politics, survived for centuries. The Battle of Montgizard did not save Jerusalem forever. But across the Crusader lands, from Antioch to Tripoli, news of the victory spread like a miracle. Churches rang bells for 3 days, monks recited rosaries without rest. In Rome, the cardinals debated whether Baldwin should be seen as a living martyr king, chosen by God to bear suffering in place of all Jerusalem. But it was enough to make a king into legend. After the battle, Baldwin was carried back like a living saint, not because of divine magic, but because he had gone to war when stronger men were debating surrender. In a letter from Rome, Pope Alexander III wrote, "Baldwin, though his flesh and bones are worn, remains a mirror of heaven in this mortal world. To win is to prolong, not to overturn." The victory at Montgizard did not destroy Saladin, it only delayed him. From 1178 onward, Saladin expanded his supply lines in Syria, strengthened alliances with nomadic tribes, and never again repeated the mistake of dividing his forces. Baldwin knew that too. He was under no illusion. After Montgizard, he rebuilt southern fortresses, reinforced Gaza, and summoned a council in Jerusalem to prepare for succession. The victory of 1177 was not a final chapter. It was a comma, in a sentence about to walk into tragedy. A kingdom does not die from defeat, but from not knowing who will live to replace it. After the Battle of Montgizard in 1177, Baldwin IV was not healed. He merely lived longer. And each additional day of life meant another day Jerusalem had no clear air. The royal court began to fracture, not over strategy, but over marriage. Baldwin's only sister, Princess Sibylla, became a political prize fought over by factions. His mother's side, Agnes of Courtenay, wanted to marry Sibylla to Guy of Lusignan, a noble from Poitou in western France, viewed as loyal to Western interests. Meanwhile, Raymond of Tripoli and the northern Levantine nobility leaned toward a match with Count Baldwin of Ibelin, a man rooted in the region and more familiar with its dynamics. Baldwin IV, though frail, resisted his mother's wishes. He hesitated to elevate Guy so quickly because he saw what others refused to: immaturity, arrogance, and a lack of resolve. But time was not on his side. A king without fingers to choose a successor. From 1178 to 1180, Baldwin's condition deteriorated sharply. According to the records of William of Tyre, he had to be carried into council chambers, placed on a padded chair, his hands wrapped to retain shape, and his mouth too dry to speak in full sentences. His left eye was completely blind, his right barely functioning. No one dared speak loudly, not out of fear, but to avoid overwhelming him. Yet Baldwin still listened, still remembered, still ruled. He lost sensation in both hands, suffered chronic inflammation in his eyes and ears, and could no longer ride or write. At every meeting, he had to be propped upright, with someone reading and recording on his behalf. But his mind remained sharp, and he grew more anxious as he watched the court split further over the future. In 1180, in a shocking move, Baldwin agreed to marry Sibylla to Guy of Lusignan. According to some accounts, the wedding was held hastily during Holy Week, without many Levantine nobles present, and without full consultation of the royal council. Baldwin acted not out of trust, but because he feared Raymond of Tripoli and the Ibelins might be consolidating power through marriage. Jerusalem could not afford a civil war. The cost of that stability would become clear in years to come. Guy of Lusignan not only lacked roots in the Levant, but was also seen as an outsider by both the knightly orders and local nobility. Some Templar commanders showed coldness, while the Hospitallers remained neutral, worried that Jerusalem might be dragged into a succession war without a strong hand at the reins. There was no heir, only desperate delay. Baldwin tried to establish a plan for succession. In 1183, he crowned Sibylla's young son, Baldwin V, as co-king, hoping to offer the court a way forward. The coronation took place in a heavy atmosphere. Many nobles did not attend, some knightly orders remained silent, and the gathered crowd did not cheer as they usually would. Though crowned, the child, not yet 6 years old, could not understand that he had just become the center of a struggle that would determine Jerusalem's fate. But Baldwin V was too young, and Guy, though his stepfather, was even less worthy. So now Jerusalem had two kings, one who could not stand, one who could not speak, and between them a court paralyzed by indecision. No one dared support Guy too loudly for fear of alienating the knightly orders. No one dared bet on Baldwin V because the boy could not yet sign a decree. Every decision became a negotiation, every edict the result of compromise. And outside Jerusalem's walls, Saladin kept moving toward them, step by step, like a lengthening sunset over the Holy Land. No night came through the pass, only wind and bad news. From 1184 to 1185, winters in Jerusalem grew longer. Not because of the weather, but because hope kept shrinking. Baldwin IV, though still trying to appear in public, could no longer hide the devastation of leprosy. His right hand had only 3 fingers left. The skin on his face cracked dry. His vision was nearly gone. Each time he left the palace, guards had to guide him with a wooden staff, as if the king were a blind beggar in his own city. Saladin was a different story. After 1183, he won without fighting. Baldwin had sent envoys to Europe, to Rome, Paris, and London, pleading for aid. But no kingdom answered. King Henry II of England was entangled in disputes with his sons. Philippe II of France was still too young, and Emperor Frederick I was bogged down in wars with the Italian city-states. Jerusalem's cry for help vanished into the wind like a hymn no one heard. Crusader fortresses in the east surrendered one by one or signed truces. Northern nobles sent letters seeking peace. Pilgrimages from the west dwindled, and most dangerously, there were no reinforcements. No European king called for a new crusade. In private meetings, Baldwin admitted he was losing both strength and influence. He could no longer write, had no sensation in most of his body, and sometimes had to communicate by blinking. Once, during a meeting with Hospitaller representatives, he said only 4 words, "There's no time left," then collapsed, forcing his guards to carry him to his chamber. When faith no longer walks with weapons. In 1185, Baldwin IV relinquished power. He handed the regency to Raymond of Tripoli, once his political rival. But it was the last wise move he could make. Raymond had credibility with both the Levantine nobility and the knightly orders. He had led major campaigns and understood the geopolitics of the region better than anyone left at court. Some modern historians believe it was Raymond who negotiated short-term truces with Saladin during this period to avoid conflict while the kingdom was too weak. The kingdom needed a practical hand, not a doctrinal sword. Baldwin V, then about 6 years old, became king in name. A coronation ceremony was held at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but without the usual noble turnout. The Templars remained distant, while the clergy recited prayers in silence. Some whispered that the crowned child was not meant to rule, but to serve as a placeholder for secret negotiations. Jerusalem, in form, still had a king, but in truth, power rested with a man without a crown, and everyone knew it was only a temporary solution. When the cold isn't in the bones anymore, but in the soul. In April 1185, Baldwin IV died. There was no grand funeral, no procession through the streets, only a small, quiet escort, a few loyal knights, a handful of silent priests, and the church bells tolling to a heart that no longer beat. No statue was raised for him then, no royal eulogy, no hymn composed for the occasion. No one carved the glory of Montgisard into marble. Some clerics even avoided saying the name the Leper King, as if he were a symbol of helplessness. But to the old soldiers who once fought with spears at Ramla, to the priests who saw his torn hands lift the relic, Baldwin IV needed no statue. He deserved to be remembered as the last man who dared to ride into battle, in a kingdom that had stopped believing in victory. At the end of Baldwin IV's reign, no one argued over decrees, because no one wanted to look at the king's face. There are moments in history that don't come from the clash of swords, but from the silence inside a council chamber. And Baldwin IV, in his final year, ruled through that silence. The disease had ravaged his body so thoroughly that his courtiers began to avoid looking at his face. According to some accounts, ulcers had spread from his left cheek to his forehead, distorting the entire structure of his face. The bridge of his nose had collapsed, the mouth had stiffened, and his eyes were constantly inflamed, as if burning from the inside. The ulcer covered his left cheek entirely, and the bridge of his nose was nearly gone. His skin wrinkled like tree bark, ash-grey in colour. William of Tyre recorded, "He had lost almost all expression. Only his eyes remained open, as if still observing each person, though his vision was nearly gone." And yet, strangely, it was when he was weakest that the court became most obedient. Council meetings were held in dim light, partly to reduce irritation for Baldwin's eyes, partly to soften direct stares from officials. Many times, he only communicated through a trusted courtier, issuing orders by whisper or slow hand gestures. The less they saw of him, the less they dared to defy him. No one opposed Baldwin's decisions. Even those who had once challenged him openly, like some members of the House of Ibelin, now fell silent. No one mocked the choice of Raymond of Tripoli as regent. No one questioned the coronation of Baldwin V, a child who couldn't yet read. Not because they believed, but because they feared, not Baldwin, but what might come after him. They didn't see a strategy. They saw a crumbling wall, holding back a flood no one could name. When a missing face became the face of the kingdom, a king without a face had no face to save. Baldwin cancelled all public audiences. Royal birthday celebrations and official ceremonies were shortened or removed. Western envoys, if they came, were received only by the regent, never allowed to meet the king. He governed like a man behind a curtain, appearing only through his voice or a slight nod. The people of the city no longer saw him. The palace gates remained closed. The balconies where the king once appeared were draped in curtains for months, but they whispered about him more, as if that absent presence was the only thing left they could believe in. Some townspeople quietly placed olive branches outside the holy shrine gates, not to pray, but as if to say, "We still know you're alive." To the city guards, he was the one who had once led them into battle. To the priests, he bore the rotting flesh of the kingdom on their behalf. To the enemy, he was the stillness before the storm. Jerusalem spent its final months under the shadow of a king without a face, yet present in every decision. And then, he withdrew, quietly, without a word, no longer choosing a successor. The kingdom drifted into a haze, between a young king who didn't yet understand the crown, and an old king no one dared to look at anymore. When a kingdom no longer has the strength to fight, it sends out cries for help. Throughout the year 1184, amid fevers and the stabbing pain from rotting flesh, Baldwin IV still did not give up on Jerusalem. Though he could no longer walk outside, he still had one thing left to use: reputation. Jerusalem, though withering, remained the greatest religious symbol of Western Christianity. Baldwin understood that well, and he played his final card. Sending a key diplomatic mission, led by Jocelyn III of Courtenay, Patriarch Heraclius, and representatives of the Templar and Hospitaller orders, carrying a fragment of the true cross, the last sacred relic of the kingdom, to Europe to call for a new crusade. The delegation left in winter and returned in silence. In October 1184, the delegation led by Count Jocelyn of Courtenay and Patriarch Heraclius departed Jerusalem. They carried the true cross relic, a letter from Baldwin, and a plea sealed in red wax stamped with blood. Their journey stretched through the winter, from the port of Acre, through Sicily to Rome, then Paris, and finally London. In Rome, Pope Lucius III promised to read the letter at a council, but was busy dealing with uprisings in northern Italy. In Paris, King Philippe II claimed insufficient funds and an unstable throne as reasons he couldn't wage war. In London, King Henry II received the envoys with honour, but was distracted by war with his son, Prince Richard of Aquitaine. A response was postponed indefinitely. No one promised to raise an army. No one was willing to open another front, while Europe was internally divided. When faith travels far, but no army follows. While the delegation wandered abroad, Saladin besieged Kerak, where Guy of Lusignan and Princess Sibylla were celebrating their wedding. Though gravely ill and unable to ride, Baldwin IV still had himself carried to the battlefield, an act that moved the army and unsettled the enemy. News of the siege reached Jerusalem like a slow arrow. Baldwin had to issue commands without knowing the full situation. Matters worsened when many northern nobles expressed reluctance to expend their resources on a war the king no longer understood, and the regent lacked authority to lead. When the envoys returned in the summer of 1185, they brought back nothing but prayers. Jerusalem, once the starting point of the First Crusade, was now merely a name that reminded people of things long past. And Baldwin IV, now holding no illusions, began preparing to depart. When Patriarch Heraclius bowed to present the unanswered letter from Rome, Baldwin did not read it. He simply looked toward the window, where light passed through the silver silk curtain. According to his courtiers, in his final days, he spoke not a word. He only asked for an old crucifix and a map of the city of Jerusalem to be placed by his bedside. No one was allowed in, except an old priest who had once taught him the scriptures as a child. He didn't open the gates to heaven, but he held them longer than anyone thought possible. Baldwin IV didn't die as a king. He died as a gatekeeper, quietly and forgotten, right in the city he once saved. No trumpets, no prophets, just a rolled-up map on the table, and an arm no longer whole. No one knows the exact day of his death. Some sources say April, others lean toward early May of 1185, right after Easter and before Ascension Day. According to a monk at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Baldwin had fallen into a stupor for several days and passed away in silence at dawn before the church bells rang. The only thing certain, he did not die in the king's bed, but in a small room behind the chapel, where he once hid from pitiful stares. When an emperor is not mourned, there was no grand funeral, no military parade, no 3-day ringing of bells, as was customary for a king's death. The funeral rites were reduced to near invisibility, not from a lack of mourning, but because the court was in disarray, and no one wanted to revive a symbol too powerful, while factions scrambled for power. Those who had once stood under his banner were now busy deciding who to serve. Regent Raymond of Tripoli, the figure of the native nobility, or Guy of Lusignan, the new blood backed by Princess Sibylla. The knightly orders were split. The Templars leaned toward Guy, while the Hospitallers kept a cautious distance. The division showed in every council meeting, where the king's death was mentioned far less than succession calculations. The orders sent word quietly. The church whispered prayers, no grand mass. On the streets of Jerusalem, no one stopped. The only person who placed flowers in front of the Holy Sepulchre was an old guard once saved by him at Montgisard. He said nothing, just stood there for 3 hours. When history does not carve a name, but cannot erase the shadow, there is no statue of Baldwin IV in the churches of Europe. No medals, no epics. Chronicler William of Tyre, once Baldwin's tutor, recorded only a few calm lines. My student has passed, a man of resilience in a decaying body. The kingdom has no one like him left. Only a legend remains, of a king who couldn't hold a sword, but defeated Saladin at 16. In the century that followed, people spoke of him as a whisper. There was once a man who fought while his flesh fell away, and never complained. Baldwin IV, the king without a face, held Jerusalem not by power, but by refusing to die earlier, like a gatekeeper who knows that behind him is a cliff, and if he falls, everything collapses. He didn't build more walls, didn't expand borders, but he kept the gate from falling to the very last second. And sometimes that alone is enough to make history bow. He didn't embrace his people, but they still remember being protected. In the memories of many, Baldwin IV left behind no voice, no long letter, no final speech. He left behind a silence. Those who lived in the city at that time said they had never seen the king in person, but they remembered the scent of incense during prayers when he was still alive. They remembered the nights the guards at the gate tightened their watch when news came that Saladin was near, because the king had a fever but still gave orders. They remembered the strange sense of calm in the city, as if someone was watching, even if unseen. No one embraced him, and yet no one abandoned him. Baldwin IV had leprosy from childhood. The law forbade the sick from touching others, even family. No one held his hand when he won at Montchisar. No one stroked his back when he coughed up blood in the night. For 24 years, he was never embraced, and could never embrace anyone. Yet the paradox was this: many remembered Baldwin as a protector. A young monk, later serving under Saladin's court, wrote in his journal, William of Tyre, his contemporary historian and former teacher, recorded, "His mind surpassed his age, and his will surpassed his body." A pilgrim from Marseille left this testimony. "I never saw the king, but I was told he was still lucid, and that alone made us believe the city still lived. We once saw a city stay alive because of the silence of a man who could touch no one, and when he died, everything began to collapse. When memory doesn't come from images, but from feeling." After Baldwin's death, for many years, the nightly orders left an empty chair in council, quietly called the Gatekeeper's Corner. On letters sent from Jerusalem to the west, the royal seal was replaced with a blank circle. No one knew who suggested it, but no one objected. Raymond of Tripoli once said in a quiet council, "We need a successor, but who is silent enough to replace him?" No statue of him was ever made, because no one dared sculpt that disfigured face. But when they mentioned the leper king, they knew exactly who. He became an invisible image, not clear, not concrete, but always present in the feeling that someone had once borne the pain for them. There was once a gatekeeper who could not touch, but whom everyone remembered for making them feel shielded. There was once a king, not sitting on a throne, but lying behind the door. And sometimes memory is stronger than history carved in stone. There are people who are not born to win, but to hold on to what is about to be lost. Baldwin IV did not reverse the course of history. He did not defeat Islam. He did not restore Jerusalem to its golden age. He did not shift the balance of power between East and West. But he did something no one else could. He delayed the inevitable. For 7 years as king, though never healthy for even a single day, Baldwin kept the city from collapsing, the army from disbanding, and the people from panicking. He ran a kingdom from behind a curtain, with a hand no longer whole, and a voice fading with every fever. When he died, the kingdom began to crack. Less than 2 years later, the Battle of Hattin happened. Jerusalem fell to Saladin. No one could stop the disaster, but Baldwin slowed it down. And sometimes, just someone willing to bear the pain for one more year, to endure one more layer of violent wind, is enough for history to carve their name not in